You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG. Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On our very first show, we will be discussing a recent Session 0. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name is Matt, and with me as always is my good friend and GM colleague, Jody.
Hey, what's happening, buddy? What's happening, everybody? Glad to be here. Let's do this thing.
Let's do it. Today's episode focuses on starting Shadowdark campaigns with Session Zeros, a fitting topic for our very first episode of the show. Jody, you recently ran myself and 3 other players through a Session 0. So tell us what happened at the table.
All right, let's get you into it. Yeah, we're starting a new summer campaign in my setting of Ire, using the Shadowdark rules as my home system. I had a few goals for this micro campaign as we set out. First, I wanted to make sure that you, Matt, got a chance to take a turn as a player this summer, since you've been predominantly GMing like all summer long, all the games, all the time. Thank you, by the way.
I truly appreciate it. It's very nice to be a player for a short time period.
Get you out from behind the screen that neither of us use. And next up, second goal. We have a friend, Chris, who is part of our Sunday sessions, which are like more of a one-shot kind of format where it's just straight dungeon crawl and jump in. And I wanted to give him a chance to play in something a little more narratively driven. And then lastly, I wanted to get back to my own campaign setting and world, and then running my preferred style of game, which is a trad style game. We can get into that a little bit more later, but with a narrative focus. We'll say it that way for now. So once I'd laid out the player group and I'd figured out who was going to play, Matt, my wife, our friend Chris, our friend Jessica, I realized only one player of that group had recently played in my campaign setting. And if I wanted to have like a narrative drive the game and we were only going to play 4 sessions, well, it seemed like a good time to use a Session 0. It was really going to be helpful to lay out some groundwork. Now, I am historically kind of dubious of Session 0s. It's not,
just to say the least, Jody.
Yeah, I have feelings and opinions, but I hadn't run one in a really long time. So I figured it was a good time to give it another go. You had asked some questions of me in the past about why I have such strong feelings about them. This was a good opportunity to shed a little torchlight onto some of my default GMing habits that have been festering in the depths of the Shadowdark, maybe not to my advantage. So, setting out with my campaign guide in hand, I know my world. I consulted the sages of the internet and scoured a few sacred tomes to build a one-pager for the day, and we can get you a link to that if you're curious. So what did I set out to do? I basically had 6-7 things I wanted to get done during our Session 0. First off, per the wisdom of the internet, reviewed the style of game. Again, it's a trad style game, so a traditional style game where it's world story first. So there's my job as GM is to be delivering a satisfying story for the players themselves to play through. To that end, I grabbed the Shadowdark rules, let my players know that, hey, because we're playing Shadowdark, death is possible. Yes, we're going to try and tell a story, but yes, your character might die. Then for theming and flavor, this was item 2. I wanted to establish what is the theme and flavor that we're going to go with. I tend to default to running to kind of a frontier, grittier world vibe. And I grabbed the Sinister Secrets of Saltmarsh and Ghosts of Saltmarsh from 5e. I grabbed the OG module and the new book. And I mean, at its simplest explanation, if you don't know the different styles of play, a trad game is like running out of a module. There's a story there and you're playing through a classic.
Plot.
Yeah, there's
right,
a plot. Yeah. So this particular plot relies heavily on investigation and combat. More on the investigation than the combat, but it's there because, again, we're starting at level 1. So once I did that, I provided my players with a zine. This is something I've picked up from Matt over the years of campaign primer, if you will. So I built my own little zine. The front page of that is here's the history, here's the factions, here's the lore dump that you need, which is one of, as we'll get into, one of the things that really a Session 0 does that I that's hard to do if you hit the ground running without a session zero, is give that background and that world lore to your players in a way that isn't painful. All right. The last thing that I picked up, and this was from my research, was that, or one of the last things rather, was what separates this campaign from others. And one of the key things I wanted to make sure we were clear on was that we were going to be playing with a short duration. We only had 4 sessions, including the session zero, just because we're almost all teachers or we work in education. So summer sadly was going to dwindle to an end before we knew it. And we had fixed dates already on the calendar. That was kind of the core thing, is we spent some time just via email squaring away when can everybody freaking play. So we got that done. So that was something I did want to touch base on. Another thing that as we started moving away from just like lore dumping and like logistic stuff and started talking about, okay, now that you as a player hopefully have a sense of the setting and the place and the world that you're getting into, here's the classes I'm going to use. Here's the house rules I'm going to use. We did go through that. Here's how the ancestries I'm going to use for my campaign setting fit into this region. And then it was really a matter of just letting the players build their characters out. And I concluded the character building with, found a character relationship D100 table.
It's so good.
Cannot plug that thing enough, because what it does is, instead of what traditionally happens is like you roll a D20 and it's like, hey, Bob, you rolled a 12, so you are now siblings with Sally. Go. What this one does that's different is it's a D100 table, and it provides a context for 2 players to discuss their background. And what I did was like, hey, you and you, this is what the table says. Sort out, one of you owes a debt to the other one. Why? What happened? One of you feels a tremendous amount of guilt and responsibility for the others. Who does? What does? Sort that out once your characters are built. So this happened after the nuts and bolts of building characters. And then I broke from some of the traditional wisdom of session zero, and through what was intended to be a quick travel montage, got my players into the starting town through a series of kind of vignettes and lore dumping and secrets. And we were playing, like we ended up that it was role play only, but we were rolling dice and we were playing with these new characters that we'd found, and literally kind of montaged through travel into town, and then got them embedded in town of Salt Marsh, for those who know the adventure, and got them up and rolling. So in the matter of about, it was about 3 hours, 4 hours, give or take, we played through our session zero. And I have to say, overall, I was pretty darn happy with how the thing went.
All right, Jody, that was a spectacular run through of your session zero. So let's kind of lay out the stakes here. Like, what is the challenge that you faced as a GM here? Just to kind of give you my perspective on just the general challenges of a session zero. When I think about session zeros, I think about this huge, wide open, amorphous, abstract thing, right? That's like everyone kind of, to use a vocabulary, it's like a shibboleth in our hobby is, people just kind of throw out like, well, if there's a problem with somebody's campaign, somebody will be like, well, you should have had a session zero.
Right.
But there's not great definitions for, at least as far as I can tell, for what a session zero should be for specific types of games. There's lots of information where people lay out what session zero should be. I mean, I don't know. Does that speak to to the challenges or?
Yeah, most definitely. Now, I want to, in my from the table kind of overview there, I did mention that I do have some bias towards session zero. I'm going to address that right off the bat. And it remains my one most valid critique, and why you might not want to session zero is, so you got everybody together, right? Everybody's gathered. Everybody's excited to play this new campaign or get into this game of this RPG. Why aren't you playing? Like, you did the hardest thing. You got everybody there. Why aren't you playing? I don't know if I've answered that, but the point you brought up, Matt, of what a session zero should be, the wisdom of the internet was overwhelming. There was so much of it. Mm-hmm. And you should be doing a session zero. What I found, though, was, in the least surprising take of ever, there wasn't much nuance to the discussion. Even watching 45-minute long YouTube videos on what is a session zero and what should it be, almost every piece of information I found assumed you were going to sit down and play the world's greatest role-playing game. You know, you're going to play 5e, which is great. And I will say this, if you are playing in a modern style, character-centric, where you are playing a game that is exclusively and specifically character-centric, there's a ton of great information about what you should do in a session 0. There's a lot of good stuff out there. A lot. If you are deviating from that in any way, you are going to play something that is OSR, something that is more role-play heavy, something that is, meaning more of a role-play heavy, I'm thinking of like games like Call of Cthulhu, something that is more of a, as I said, a trad or a traditional game where it is plot focused. There is a central narrative.
And when you say plot focused here, I just want to be very clear that like the plot focused game that you're running is different from a character-centric, plot-focused game in a couple of very important ways. And this is going to be a nice little test to see how well your session 0 went, right? Like, how well did I internalize this? We've, of course, talked about this outside the context of this session 0, but from my understanding of what you explained just a couple of days ago is the world exists. There is a thing happening in the world, right? There is a story that is happening in this town and in the various adventure locations that we might go to. And our job as characters is to engage with that story.
Yeah.
The story is not constructed to lift our characters up. It is our job as players to really to do that ourselves. Like how are you going to find space in the story for your character? And that's actually where the fun of being a player is kind of, you know, fiddling about in this world and then having the character kind of reveal themselves through play, rather than the more character-focused game where like you arrive at the table or you build a backstory at the table and now suddenly the GM is like incorporating your backstory. Like I'm just going to be blunt about this, or I guess ask you bluntly, like, you don't really care what my backstory is for this game to a very large degree, right? Like, if I'm getting this correctly.
Yeah, I use it as a tool, but the story's going to happen.
Right, you might highlight certain things.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully that came across, that I was leveraging those background pieces and things to figure out how to deliver you guys clues in a way that made sense and felt like you were still part of this world. But yeah, you have it largely correct. That if...
Yeah, but my 5-page backstory that I wrote, Jody, is not going to feature in this adventure.
Probably not at all. Zero.
But the Shadowdark backgrounds, to be very specific here, the ones we rolled randomly, those you immediately found ways to make those relevant.
Right.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is
they aren't going to drive the narrative.
Right. And you're not expecting us, nor should we expect you to engage with a long, drawn-out backstory that means this character is like fully formed when they walk on stage, so to speak.
Right. One of my asks of you guys before the session 0 was, please come with an open mind, and then we're going to work through the process. Don't show up with a character, right? Like, don't show up with a character. That would be counterproductive, frankly, because you don't have all the information yet with which to build this. So yeah, and that's really at its core the difference between a classic trad game and what's sometimes referred to as a neo-trad or a new traditional game or a new school game. And that was really at the core challenge I ran into, was taking my own biases and setting them aside of being frustrated that I have started many a campaign and we played a session 0 and then we played one more time and then that was the end of it. And I was like, we could have played twice and we only played once. Setting that aside, which I became pretty comfortable with pretty quickly, frankly, but then going, okay, but I want all of the information I'm getting and being fed and is in the books I have is all talking about this modern style of adapting what I'm going to do to the player characters. And not only that, but what my players want me to run. Like, in a weird way, there were multiple sources I read through and watched that, like, frankly vilified the idea of you as a GM having a campaign setting. Like, it genuinely felt like it was an attack. Like, I felt like I was wrong for having my campaign setting with my, styles of play and things.
You're like idiosyncratic kind of.
This is how my gnomes work, and there's 2 flavors of humans.
Well, I'm furious about. Jody.
I know. I'm sorry, man. I am genuinely sorry about that. That there's no half orcs. How dare I? But or half elves. That's not a thing. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
How dare I? But that's really in terms of like getting to the heart of like, so where might a session 0 be challenging? That's where I found it incredibly challenging, frankly, was like I had to really cobble stuff together and think very carefully about what style of game do I want to run, and does the wisdom of the internet or these resources I've gathered that are understandably pointing at the current contemporary visible milieu of the RPG space, it's not that's not what I'm doing. And historically have had some disconnect with that of, not delivering that sort of very deeply player centric as opposed to world centric style of game. So yeah, that was my core challenge. And again, can't say enough. I'm stoked I came out the other side going like, no, I felt really good about that. I felt like I was able to get out what I needed to get out to my players, and hopefully you guys went into it feeling the dirt under your feet and the soil and the air and feeling the world in a way that felt believable and easy to grapple with.
All right. So on that note, Jody, let us now gather round the fire and have a little bit of discussion. Okay. And this is, I think for me, where I want to give you kind of my thoughts.
Yeah.
I've only had a couple days to kind of really think about this. So this is good. This is actually like, I've really tried to not unpack the session as much as possible so we can do it here live on air. So 2 things right off the top, Jody, and I guess both these are actually more for our listeners. The first is that you and I have house-ruled Shadowdark in a number of ways.
Yep.
And this campaign was going to be no different. The second thing is zines. If you are listening to this and you haven't like looked into making a very basic like 4-page zine for your players, I highly recommend that. Having a booklet that you can hand to your players that is, in terms of Shadowdark, the same size as the book.
Yeah.
And you can find Shadowdark templates to use with Affinity, InDesign, or other free layout tools. I really, really, really want to stress that, like, even if you're just using a true one-pager where you have a couple of columns and you make it in Word or another word processor, a handout that you can hand your players. Okay, and you and I are both teachers, and so we do this kind of naturally. But I think the handout is something that maybe a lot of GMs might think, oh, well, it might not be that big of a deal. Huge. Yeah. Huge. Kudos on the zine.
Thanks, man. That's actually really high praise because yours have reached a level of expertise and passion that you don't get credit for from our play group because we are spoiled and just expect them now from our zine overlord, we'll say, and not use the other name, our zine master. So it was a little bit intimidating to make that very modest one to deliver because the standard had been set of what those needed to look like. But also had that template of your work, and then reading zines. I mean, if you're not checking out the indie zine space right now, and
just the Cursed Scrolls, man,
or just the Cursed Scrolls,
come on.
If you love RPGs, well, if you're not looking at the Cursed Scrolls, do yourself a favor. There you go. That's the whole takeaway. I'm done.
Yeah, get on it. Go buy the Cursed Scrolls immediately. Buy them twice. Buy them 4 times. The thing about the zine that kind of is a nice transition into my first kind of point of feedback is that I think a reference tool is a really great way to, in the early stages of a campaign, when players are just kind of figuring out their character, to give them something to go back to kind of ground themselves in is really great. So the first thing that I want to say is your session 0 did exactly what it was supposed to do, right? It delivered on all the things that you laid out in that first segment there. The one thing I want to talk through is the fact that that there was a fair amount, like a big chunk of just kind of you talking at us.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is avoidable, but I think that both you and I would agree, again, because we're classroom teachers and we work with high school students, right? Like if you try and just kind of like lecture players, I mean, eventually you kind of reach a maximum lecture-matude.
Oh, definitely.
And I think I want to kind of talk through like your thoughts on how that went. I didn't find it to be overwhelming, although I did find myself at various times, either I kind of knew something already, and so I kind of found myself kind of ebbing and flowing in and out.
Yeah.
And I was wondering like what your thoughts were on that. Kind of want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So it's worth noting that of the zine I delivered, which was 16 pages, I don't know if it was even that long, only the first page was a straight lore dump.
Yeah.
And I did borrow heavily Mike Shea of Sly Flourish. He has a Saltmarsh one pager, and I used his as kind of a template of what I should include, what should I build from, what are some of the highlights I want to hit for the lore dump. Because there are a few things more boring than hearing about somebody else's D&D game. What's yours? I had a dream. Is that the like?
there are two ways you should never start a sentence. One of them is let me tell you about this dream I had, and the other one is ironically, given that we're doing this, let me tell you this podcast I've been listening to. The third one is, and maybe the worst of them all is let me tell you about my D&D character. But the fourth is let me tell you about my D&D world.
Yeah, and that might be the worst. So I was all of that was to beautifully demonstrate the point of I was keenly aware of like, it's a session 0. I have players who have not played in my campaign setting. I'm running a region of my campaign map that is not detailed. We are adding detail to the world map. So I need to do this as well. So I got to keep it as tight as I can. So my lens was largely what are useful pieces of information. Also, it's why I started with it when we gathered and the class came to session, as it were. There is a golden moment when you settle into a class as a teacher or as a student, and the noise finally trickles down, and the vast majority of the class is tuned in. Those first few moments are golden. I knew that first golden moment was like, hey, if I'm going to lore dump, I need to lore dump here and try and keep it tight. And one of the features of my lore dump is people who have played in my campaign setting before will hear things that they're like, oh, wait, that was my campaign. Oh, wait, that I did that. Had my daughter been playing, there was a whole summer campaign I ran 2 years ago that there would have been notes in there that only she would have got. You gave my wife a hard time about, what do you mean the dragons rampaging?
They didn't kill a dragon.
They didn't kill a dragon.
I thought the whole purpose of this other campaign was they were supposed to kill this dragon. No dragon death.
No, but she did tell you they did save the world as far as her character is concerned.
As far as my character is concerned, he knows nothing about that.
Yeah, that's just terrible up there. It's all bad.
So here's, and I love, so I want to point out two things that you said. The first is this idea of like when the class comes to session. And this is the thing that I'm going to do in the future for future session zeros, because I will inevitably run more games. The thing that I want to do, and the thing that I'm going to take away from this, or at least one thing, is what does a strong start to a session 0 look like? And the reason I ask this is like, the most interesting parts of your lore dump were the parts that were going to be relevant to us as characters.
Sure.
And so I think it's super cool and important that you call out the things that other players are going to recognize. But I also, in the spirit of just trying to like do these things better, like I think I didn't really realize sitting on the other side of the table, because I've done this before, right? Like these, let me tell you about the campaign setting kind of spiels that go on forever, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to give your players too little information, so they make a character that's not going to fit in, but you don't want to give them too much, so they glaze over and they don't really actually hear anything. And so I'm trying to think, and maybe listeners can kind of come in with what is the best way to start a session 0, because I don't think it's rolling dice. I don't think it's rolling up a character immediately. But I do think that much like we do in class, Jody, I think there's an opportunity for, could you give players a small blurb about the world and then have them do some sort of activity, right? Like thinking like almost like a quick write or something, something along those lines to break it up. That's what I think I'm getting at, is like, how could we break this up in a way that maybe we can't. Maybe there's nothing for it but to punt and just kind of, go
and that's
through
what
it.
I went for, was like, I'm just going to, as being mindful of your guys' time and attention, because that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Is get through what I need to get through as fast as I can, and try and keep pushing it towards information you can use, knowing you're about to build characters, right? Like, how do I push this camera lens? And that was one of the things I think if you gave me a do-overs, I would take the cinematic cutscene. And what I would probably do, and I've done this before, it's weird that I didn't think about it on the day, but when you're planning a new thing, you got all the whole world is in your head. Sometimes you miss stuff. A great tool is the old, my English teaching background's kicking in right now, but the omniscient narrator, third person limited narrator, first person narrator. And you transition through those as the camera, for those who love cinema, the wide angle, zoom in until you're looking at a bug in the grass. If I had done it where I was thinking about movie framing scenes, I could have said, in the land of Aradris, we set our scene in the far north, paint a picture with a dragon. And you guys literally had the map in front of you. And I could have said, now panning south, we see, and further south until we land at the village of... I could have done that at least, but that's playing into the fact that both as a classroom teacher and just as a GM, one of the things I'm very comfortable doing is extemporaneous narration or frankly lecturing. Like, some GMs are good at, if they have the spotlight, they can capture an audience. Not all GMs are, and you have to be honest about what your skill set is, right? If that's something you're not comfortable doing, that you're not, you're not comfortable trying to weave a story with your words or thinking in terms of cinematic shots and zooming in until we're at the front gates of the city of Saltmarsh, don't do that. Then maybe it's like Matt said, it's like, hey, here's a list of bullet points. Hey, player one, what jumps out to you in that list? Oh, I noticed it mentions this great white worm. Oh yeah, let me tell you a little bit about, hey, player two, what jumped out to you? And it just make it a conversation. That'd be easy with a line of bullet points where each bullet point is like some crazy little factoid. That could be really fun. And be more of a conversational kind of approach. But at some point, I mean, part of the session zero is, if you're going to do it, you need to give your players the world so that they can ultimately build characters that fit what you're about to do.
Yeah, so I will say, like, you were successful at doing this. I don't want to make it seem like you weren't. And one of the things that I tried to do in our Dolmenwood game that I've been running,
using the Shadow Dark rules.
Yeah, basically, I guess what I should say is, aside from changing all of the ancestries, the core rules are the same. The thing that I did in session zero that I wish I could go back and maybe not do, there's a lot of discussion about this actually in the Dolmenwood community about, like, how do you introduce such a weird and bananas setting that does not adhere to like normal fantasy setting conventions in many ways. I opted to just kind of let you all... I kind of hoped that the art and that the vibes that I was putting out as GMs kind of like would get us there. And to be honest, like, they have, but
yeah, they help.
It took longer for us to get into the world, I think, because I didn't do the initial work of setting things up. I tried to extemporaneously in game, right? So maybe you call it like diegetically do the thing.
Right.
Right.
Which
like,
is my default. If I don't do session zeros, usually that's my default.
And I don't think that is, I think that doing them together is great. And I think that maybe is the thing that I want to kind of work on next time around is how do I balance the upfront lore that players need to know with the amount of diegetic stuff, the amount of stuff that I can do in game, like describing the world in a very specific way, playing an NPC with the express purpose of showing the characters the world, right? Like, that's an interesting thing that if you have players who are malleable and willing to go with it, you can do it extemporaneously. But if you have a player who's not role play centric, like that's going to really put them off. And so you might have to, and I don't know, that's where I'm at. I don't know where that balance is. I want to kind of find it. It's different for every campaign, of course, and it's different for every table. Those two asterisks are, of course, like, go without saying. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like how to balance those two things?
So, and I don't know if this translates. This is a good chance for me to ask my player a question, is when I built the zine, and I mentioned this at the table, and I said, hey, the rest of this book should lay out in a way that helps you build your character. And kind of my subtext hope there was you would notice the changes and the things I'd added because there were new ancestries. That was one of the things we jumped in. I said, hey, you have 6 ancestries to choose from. So I've added gnomes, and I have 2 flavors of humans. I have my Southlanders and my
very
Northlanders.
Cool, by the way. Very cool. Love that.
And it was and then elves, dwarves, and halflings. That's my 6. And so it was like immediately as a player, my hope was you would go, oh, well, wait, these are different. And then I was like, oh, when you please do roll on the background table because I've rewritten the background table to this region. So there was an amount of world building that I was hopeful that as you flipped through, you'd go, oh, what are these new classes I can play? And all I did is I took some of the cursed scrolls and other release classes. You can play a witch. You can play a air quotes barbarian, pit fighter. Again, cursed scroll, man. Great resource. Check it out.
Pick them up. Buy 5.
Bard and Ranger are available all the time. And then the core 4 are there as well. So, those were available. But then seeing, oh, wait, the very first class entry says barbarian, because all I did was change the name from pit fighter to barbarian for my use. And so there was a hope that some of the world building also was happening. I did change out the art in a lot of like the art pieces I took for my own private personal use from old school art, but I made sure they were things that looked coastal, or it was a person in the wilds, or, or little things like that you can lay out the world in those ways. So my 3 core assumptions about session 0 these days are deliver the world, give your players the necessary tools and mechanics for your campaign. So we're talking ancestries, classes, and house rules. And then lastly, play. Have something tight and small to do.
Yeah,
let the players walk through those first few very awkward steps in the shoes of their character. The first 30 minutes, 30 lines of dialogue from your character are awkward every time. Whether you as a player default to going big and you're like, I'm going to crank it to 11 to see where I feel weird.
Hello, that's me.
I love it about you. Or I'm going to very quietly think through in the third person, which is my wife. Like, she plays in the third person for a long time, and it's her letting the character reveal itself to her. It might be sessions before you get first person dialogue out of her character. Great, cool. But those first few lines suck. It's awkward. It's, hello, I am Gallstaff, sorcerer of light. Like, that's how it feels. And I don't care how experienced you are. It is so rare. You're like, I write up this character and I got him. No, so play a little bit.
All right, well, let's take a break, hear from our sponsors, and then Jody will come back. We'll kind of lay out our conclusions and core takeaways from this discussion that we just had, do some end credits, and we'll get out of here. Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by the Wandering Shop's next Coffer Quest crowdfunding project, The Hammer. Are you weighed down by not just your gear, but also a crippling debt from a week of carousing? Well, before you go gallivant off to some dark, forsaken place to risk your life in search of fortune and glory, might I ask if you've brought a hammer? Not heard of a hammer before? Well, the gods smile upon you today, my dear crawler. If you contribute just a few measures of gold now as an upfront investment, you could be the proud owner of a tool that will change your life in about a year's time. This crowdfunding project acquired all of the necessary finances within the first 2 minutes of placing a flyer on the local tavern's bulletin board. But the more coin they raise, the more value for you and your fellow investors. Don't miss a chance to get in on the ground floor of the most revolutionary tool since the primordial age. Plus, this is the only time where you'll be able to acquire an exclusive pin of the Wandering Shop's emblem. Spread this message far and wide, my friends. Tell everyone, and the hammer shall be a reality. CofferQuest crowdfunding is not a store, and delivery of materials is not guaranteed. All right, Jody, before we get out of here, let's go over some, like four core takeaways from this discussion that we want to leave people with. And I don't want to belabor this, but the zine was awesome. Basically, any handout. Give your players a handout at session 0, something for them to interact with, something for them to tangibly write on, highlight, and of course, read from. What do you got?
Yeah, my first one is think about what style of game you play or run, rather. You know, I've mentioned that a bunch of times in this, the trad style of game or the new school or new trad. All of this comes from one fantastic blog entry that like genuinely changed how I feel about myself as a GM. And it's called The Retired Adventurer is the blog spot, and it's 6 Cultures of Play is the article. We'll throw a link in our show notes. Really powerful for helping you to think in terms of what style of game do I run? What is the experience I provide to my players? And understand that when you're getting tools from the internet, they may be talking about a different style of play. And then you have to do like I did and like tailor make to fit your needs and your style of play. So that was my big one is figure out what style of game you run and then adjust the list accordingly.
So my next one and my final kind of core takeaway is that vignettes are awesome. Vignettes with low stakes, meaning that there's not really a possibility of combat or player character death, but these are just opportunities for you to express character or to learn a little bit about your character. And the GM giving you fun, easy, almost cliche ways to do that.
I think number one learning point that would be my 2.0 version of this. And like if I went back and did a deep edit on that session and ran a new group of people through the exact same experience, what do my players, capital N, all bold underscore, need to know in order to get them building their characters? What is the bare minimum they have to know so they can feel comfortable making a character in this world? What is that information? One of my favorite editing expressions is the big black Sharpie, and you just go through and you cut stuff. Everything you thought you needed, get rid of as much of it as you can. I think that was a big one for me, was if I could go back, there's some things I would cut because those things can show up in the vignettes. Those things can show up during character building. You have time as a GM to sprinkle those in. You have more time than you think you do. So on that initial lore dump that is necessary, especially, really go through that whole process about, am I giving my players information they need? And then I think you're never going to be wrong giving people stuff they need. You can't make a mistake there.
All right. So as the torchlight grows dim, Jody, we hope that our listeners were able to find something useful in our discussion that they can take to a future game. And if you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, head on over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadow Dark Discord channel. Look for links to any material that we referenced in this episode in that thread or in the show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadow Dark Facebook page and Discord under the handle Pezman or Pez5767, or you can message me, Matt, via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, later, nerds. Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadow Dark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.